Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor for me to participate in this conference, particularly to start it. And this presentation is based on the teamwork, particularly the empirical part I'm going to sketch by the end of the talk. But the presentation proper is prepared in cooperation with Magdalena, Senderecka and BartłomiejKucharzyk. Because this is the first talk, we start with some general remarks about normativity. And we will try to suggest a typology of norms people obey or not obey, don't obey. We will address the question of origins of normativity, particularly the origins of morality. And then we will switch to self-control as a phenomenon, psychological phenomenon, which, according to our point of view, is responsible for normative behavior and normative functioning. So we will sketch some general thesis about self-control, its nature, and then we will describe our own empirical study with some results which we believe are suitable and interesting. We'll start with the meaning of normativity. This is the quotation from a philosopher, because for psychologists, the term normativity is a bit awkward. I mean, we usually don't use it. But if we concentrate on this short quotation, we will see that a statement is said to be normative if it bears about what an individual ought to, about what it is right or wrong, correct or incorrect, to do or to feel. So normative statements often express prescriptions, directions, permissions, and interdictions. They can also express evaluations to the effect that some actions or feelings are good or bad, valuable or not valuable. Such a normative vocabulary is obviously most appropriate to actions, to emotions, feelings, and to various psychological attitudes, such as desires and wants. So we have a lot of words referring to obligations, for instance, or inhibitions, or things which say what is appropriate or not appropriate, valuable or not valuable. One of the problems, the terminological problems we had to address is the distinction between normativity and rule following. This distinction is borrowed from Bartosz Brożek. According to him, we can speak about strong normativity and weak normativity. And strong normativity is something referring to the norm which is justified, whereas weak normativity is just rule following. I mean, this rule may have some justification or not. I don't know if logical rules are justified by the fact that they can be proved, because proving a syllogism may be its justification. This is the question for other people. I hope that we will hear about this question a bit. I'm talking about this distinction because sometimes I will be using the term rules and sometimes norms, and you may be confused about our meaning of these words. For psychologists, rule following is much better a word and is a much better and more convenient term than normativity. We have to realize that people obey or disobey a large number of norms, and the variety of these norms, the number of typology, the number of types or categories to which they belong is quite large. First of all, we have ethical norms and legal norms, which are usually justified enough, and sometimes they are explicitly stated. But apart from them, we have logical and mathematical rules, we have norms of prudence, norms of pragmatics. We have a lot of linguistic norms, like grammar, for instance, but also the so-called implicature, the norms of saying something in the indirect way in order to avoid awkwardness, for instance. We have norms of politeness, we have conventional norms, and we have also a number of arbitrary, let's say, rules rather than norms, rules which are completely unjustified unless one speaks about somebody's decision. In experimental psychology, for instance, we have a lot of arbitrary rules like this. This is the typical example of the arbitrary rule applied by the experimental psychologists. The task is to say the color of these words and to ignore their meaning. So in order to do this task, you have to say blue and red, which is quite difficult. I mean, almost everybody can do that, but it is costly in terms of reaction time and the probability of error. Whereas if we have the consistent stimuli, the stimulation is consistent, it's much easier. So we have the inconsistent, incongruent versus congruent stimuli, and usually we measure reaction time in both conditions. When we subtract one reaction time from the other, we can see we have the so-called Stroop effect, according to the author of this manipulation. And the magnitude of this difference is the expression, the measure of one's cognitive control, one's ability to say no to the prepotent response, to switch to something which is unusual or unnatural, completely arbitrary. We are using these kinds of tasks, experimentations, in order to measure, to investigate the cognitive aspects of cognitive control and ultimately the cognitive psychological aspects of normativity. Going to the considerations about the variety of our norms and the variety of norms people obey or disobey, we can divide norms into explicit and implicit. The explicit norms are, of course, openly stated, sometimes in terms of legal obligations, like beer is not allowed for minors, for instance. Sometimes these rules must be inferred. It's necessary to make a deduction. For instance, beer is not allowed in the presence of minors, although in some countries it's explicit too. It's not allowed to drink beer in the presence of people who are below the age. But in our country, for instance, it's not forbidden by law. It's something which is inferred as inappropriate. But beer drinkers have many other rules, of course. I'm not going to tell them in detail now. Another distinction is the division between the division into objective and subjective norms. The objective norms is of course a one which exists regardless of one's knowledge or realization, whereas the subjective norm is something a person thinks is appropriate or inappropriate. A lot of superstitions like crossing fingers or number 13 or things like that. These are the examples of norms which probably, according to our knowledge, are not applicable in the real world, although some people believe in them. So it may be stated that they are subjective, although superstitions are widespread, so they are not subjective in terms of being present in many instances, not in the particular mind. Another distinction is the distinction into the division of norms into the ones which refer to behavior and the ones which refer to thinking and mental states. For instance, not telling lies is a rule referring to our behavior, whereas not thinking about lying and not thinking about possibility of lying or doing something inappropriate refers to our mind and our thinking. Usually, thinking is more liberal than doing. in terms of we have many inhibitions, for instance, or prescriptions or rules of behavior, whereas rules of thinking are much liberal. The question is whether the rules of thinking are easier to obey. They are not necessarily easier to obey. For instance, in say, experimental psychology, we sometimes use the so-called Dostoevsky's task. The task is don't think about white bears for 5 minutes. This this question is impossible to follow because not thinking about white bears requires thinking about not thinking. This is a paradox, of course, according to which, due to which we are not able to do this task. But the consequences of disobedience are quite different in terms of behavioral and mental norms. I would say that disobedience to the mental norms, or not thinking, for instance, are less harmful because mind may be imagined or maybe conceptualized as a kind of playing ground for behavior. We can try something out in our mind without being obliged to do it. This is one of the function of our mind, I would say. So sometimes the ability to disobey rules or to break rules is even advisable and valuable, like in the case of creativity, for instance. Now, the question why people obey norms. There are plenty of factors which can be stated here. We have divided them into external and internal factors. First of all, people obey or disobey some norms because of reward and punishment, also because of social pressure, influence, conformity, and things like that. But on the other hand, we have plenty of internal factors, like emotions, for instance. Negative emotions like anxiety, guilt, disgust may cause rule following, especially in the realm of morality. And the positive emotions can be responsible for, like pride or empathy or compassion may be responsible for some specific kind of behavior, particularly charity, for instance. We can also speak about conscience, values, beliefs, etc., etc. The question of the origins of norms has been hotly debated, particularly in reference to the moral norms. The question where the morality comes from is the old one, and the literature, both philosophical and naturalistic, is quite large. On one hand, we can say about external and the ultimate, the most basic source of moral behavior. This is the creator as imagined by Stanisław Wyspiański, the stained glass work from the Franciscan Church. This is the possible source of our morality. On the other hand, we can speak about norms as origined in evolution, in our biology, in our brain. This is the Charles Darwin caricature, the 19th century caricature. These points of view are, of course, not contradictory. We know that there are limits of scientific explanation, and we know that science and religion must not, they are not in the basic contradiction, but for the evolutionary point of view, it's very important, it's crucial to find the biological roots and biological mechanisms of morality, particularly the brain mechanisms of morality. And these kind of investigations have been done by many. We know, for instance, that there are specialized neural circuits, neural mechanisms of moral reasoning. Interestingly, some of them are more active when the moral question is a personal one. This is for instance, the ventral and ventral medial prefrontal cortex, whereas the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is responsible for the impersonal reasoning, more theoretical, let's say, or more detached. There are also many other places, let's say places in the brain responsible for moral reasoning and moral behavior. The question is that in empirical science we don't have a possibility to manipulate real behavior of people. We cannot experiment with morality. What we can do is the investigation of people's reasoning about moral dilemmas, for instance, which is not the same. And this is the real and serious limitations of this kind of studies. Anyway, these studies brought about many interesting outcomes, many interesting results. For instance, we know that the temporal parietal junction, a small place in our mind right here behind our right ear, is responsible for so-called theory of mind. Theory of mind is a not good term because it's not a theory. As such, it's our ability to realize that other people have emotions, feelings. This is the ability to take other people's perspective. And this is the precondition for empathy, for instance, and compassion. If this small place in our brain is damaged, or if it's switched off, for instance, due to the transcranial magnetic stimulation, we start to be more utilitarian in our moral reasoning. We are more likely to accept immoral choices, for instance. We are more likely to accept the possibility that one human life may be spared in order to save 5 other lives, which is very difficult without this manipulation. So it shows that moral reasoning and maybe even moral behavior as well is in the brain, although it's not in one single place. Instead, it's rather a kind of network or a kind of system. Now I'm going to discuss in brief the psychological aspects of normativity. In other words, I'm going to discuss the question, what is necessary from the psychological point of view that a human being is able to obey norm or to respect norms, or let's say rules. First of all, we have to acquire norms. Acquisition of rules and norms is an indispensable condition. We have to learn these rules. This is usually done in the process of socialization and acculturation. Second, we have to have knowledge about these rules. Learning is not enough. We have the system of knowledge which is ready to use. Thirdly, we have to activate a given rule. Sometimes people don't behave according to the rule. For instance, they ignore the moral rule because although they know about this rule, because they were unable to activate it in the moment. For instance, a choice may be regarded not moral in nature. Let's imagine buying a toothpaste. Usually buying a toothpaste is not a moral choice. However, if one realizes that some kinds of toothpaste are produced on the basis of animal testing, for instance, this choice starts to be a moral one, of course. So in order to realize that buying a toothpaste is a moral choice, I have to activate the norm. Otherwise, it's not possible. Then we have to decide whether to obey or not to obey. We have to plan what, when, and how to obey or disobey. And finally, we have to execute the behavior, which means that we have to inhibit some unwanted action or behavior, or initiate the one which is wanted or appropriate. Our claim, our thesis is that regardless of the type of rule, regardless of the fact that they are moral, legal, pragmatic, etc., and regardless of the origin of the normativity, norms can be obeyed thanks to the complex human ability called self-control. So self-control is here conceptualized as the complex ability thanks to which we are able to behave according to the rule, be it legal or moral or pragmatic or whatever. Even the arbitrary rule requires self-control. So, if this claim is valid, if the claims, this assumption, let's say, is valid, we have to discuss the phenomenon of self-control. The nature of self-control is difficult to understand, in fact, although there are many attempts to define it and to understand it. According to our colleague Adam Chuderski, self-control is the human ability to organize one's actions independently of external pressure and inner physiological needs. According to others, self-control is consists in effortful attempts undertaken by a person in order to change his or her thoughts, feelings, and behavior, particularly for the sake of reaching long-distance personal goals. The investigation of self-control has been originated in the 1960s. I mean, the empirical studies, of course. And there is a famous study by Walter Mischel, a study with small children. Imagine the test. It is called a marshmallow test. The test which requires a child to inhibit the automatic tendency to eat a sweetness. The test is very simple. The psychologist or the experimenter gives the child a cake, a marshmallow, and he or she says, you can eat it, you can have it, or you can wait until I'm back in 5 minutes. And if you wait for me, I'm going to give you the second one. So the choice is between eating the marshmallow immediately or to wait to postpone the reward for several minutes. Walter Mischel demonstrated that small people, small children, are usually this is a very difficult task for them. We can see various techniques of coping with this difficult task. This is the temptation, despair, depression, and eating, yes, and giving in. What's the point here? The point is that those children who were able to wait are, as adults, are more intelligent, better behaving, reaching long-distance goals, achieving more in terms of academic or business achievement. So this ability to self-control, to postpone reward, looks to be a very, very basic one, and looks to be a very early appearing in the ontogenesis. We didn't do that, of course, but what we can do, we can follow this study and we can look for the brain correlates of self-control. The brain correlates of self-control are, of course, very numerous, and there's no one single place in the brain, of course. But there are some specialized portion and some specialized structures in the brain which are usually activated when one has to wait for the reward, for instance, or to control oneself. We can see the prefrontal cortex, of course, which is responsible for every decision-making and every control, every behavior and action which requires control. But we can also see the structure which is called ACC, anterior cingulate cortex, which is responsible for discovering the conflict, the incongruency or inconsistency between norms, for instance. This structure is active all the time. We have to deal with this conflict, and it tells other regions of the brain that something has to be done. So these kind of studies show or reveal the mechanics, the neural mechanics of self-control, although this knowledge is still in the beginning. This is the schematic representation of this ACC cortex. It is very interesting, by the way, because it's responsible both for the cognitive and emotional control, although not the same parts of this structure are responsible for both aspects of our controlled behavior. We believe that self-control needs 3 levels of analysis. Namely, we believe that self-control can be visible at the behavioral level, like in the case of Michel's children. They are eating or not eating, waiting, not waiting. Second, this is the mental level of analysis. Self-control needs specialized functions in the human mind, like inhibition, switching, and so on. And finally, there is a neural level of analysis. Self-control needs some brain structures to be executed. The question of self is another important problem. How self-control is possible to execute? How self-control is possible to exert? Does it need a willpower, for instance, a mysterious power of the mind, or maybe some kind of executive device, like for instance, in Baddeley's theory of working memory, or maybe the mind and the brain are self-regulating. I mean, self-control is possible to exert without this central executive device. Well, at the behavioral level, self-control manifests itself through the goal-directed actions, and these actions are usually found in specific situations. These situations are, for instance, situations in which we have to inhibit something, or we have to initiate something, or we have to inhibit in order to initiate, and so forth. We have the number of situations like that, and it's possible to observe human behavior in the situations requiring control. It's even possible to measure this ability through psychometric tools like questionnaires. At the cognitive level, we have a number of so-called executive functions: inhibition, switching, working memory updating, goal maintenance, and dual task coordination. From another point of view, the mental level of analysis requires the 3 types of decisions: the decision what to inhibit or initiate, when to do it, or whether to do it at all. Finally, we have the neural level of analysis, the level which shows us the neural mechanics of self-control. In our project, we aim to combine these 3 levels of self-control. We try to look at the cognitive and neural correlates of behavioral self-control, of the self-control executed at the behavioral level. And we try to look at the neural mechanisms of efficient behavioral self-control. In other words, we try to look at the brains of people whose self-control is better developed and not that better developed. We had 102 participants. 49 of them were included into the brain imaging study. The methods. We used the behavioral self-control questionnaire. This is the psychometric assessment of one's general ability to act beyond automaticity, to act in the controlled way. We have the cognitive control tasks, a battery of tasks of the executive functions like inhibition, switching, and so forth. And finally, we had the possibility to observe brain activation during the execution of the control task. The self-questionnaire, the tool to measure, to observe the self-control at the behavioral level, consisted of 36 items divided into 3 subscales: inhibition, switching, and goal maintenance. For instance, we ask people to judge, to answer the question, I often cannot get rid of intrusive thoughts. And a person was supposed to indicate this ability or inability on the scale between -3 to +3. I don't have much problem with doing 2 things at the same time. It's switching. I'm usually not late for meetings. It's goal maintenance. So we had 36 items like that. And it's important that we had 2 modes of administration. It was self-rating. I mean, a person evaluated his or herself, and we had other ratings, 2 independent judgments from people who knew the participant. Because we believe that self-control may be not easy to assess by oneself. I mean, we are not the best judges of our abilities. So in order to avoid this problem, we had the independent judgment from 2 other people. The cognitive aspect of this project was accomplished through the so-called end-back task. The end-back task is a very popular task in the experimental psychology of working memory, for instance. It consists in presenting stimuli like that, one by one. A stimulus appears for a second or 2 and disappears. It's masked usually. So the stimulus, a mask, another stimulus and the mask, still another and the mask. And the task is to press a button every time a stimulus a symbol is repeated. But the condition is it has to be repeated 2 items back. If it's repeated 1 item back, it's not the signal. I mean, it's the lure. It's the lure, you have to avoid this. If it's repeated, we didn't use other repetitions. So we had a valid repetition, 2 items back, and invalid repetitions. So this is the target, and this is the lure. The cognitive control is the ability to ignore lures, the ability not to respond to the repetition. Particularly everybody in this study had this ability. I mean, we had a huge seeding effect, particularly no mistakes. Another way to assess performance in the cognitive psychology studies is to measure reaction time, but we cannot measure time of not reacting, of course. The task is not to respond. So practically the only way to assess the people's performance in this task was to look at their brain activity. So we did it, and this is the answer of the question. How the brains of our subjects, our participants, respond to this end-back task. Here we can see the hemodynamic activity of the brain. The red color symbolizes increased activity of these regions of the brain. And this is the difference of activation. We have the baseline activation, the activation in the case of distraction. Distraction is the stimulus which is not repeated. Any other stimulus except of the lure or target. So we have the baseline activation and the activation during the lure ignoring. And if we if we subtract one from another, we have the difference signal, and the more the difference, the more activation, the relative activation of these regions of the brain. We can see increased activation in many places, let's say, but Usually they are divided into two lobes, the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe, and the difference is positive, meaning that the task consisting in ignoring rules is costly. I mean, this task needs some activation, some blood flow, some oxygen consumption, etc., etc. That's logical. I mean, when we have to do something difficult, we have to spare resources. In this case, you have to spare the resources needed by the brain. And this is the first finding, which is not unexpected at all. Another finding is that we have the correlation between this measure we have been observing on the previous slide, with self-controlled assessed with our questionnaire. This time, the correlation is negative, meaning that the more developed self-control, I mean, people who expressed in better levels of self-control at the behavioral level, measured with this questionnaire device, had relatively lesser activation in these regions of the brain, these regions of interest. In fact, everybody had increased activation, but the people with better self-control had relatively less. I mean, they behaved, their brains behaved like they needed less resources compared to person whose behavioral self-control is not that developed. So we have a very interesting phenomenon, I would say. The phenomenon which says that self-control needs brain resources. Self-control is costly, but these costs are not evenly divided into people. We have people who pay less. Everybody has to pay this cost for self-control, but some of our participants, let's say cautiously, some of our participants paid less than others, and we can say that people whose behavioral self-control is better developed pay relatively less, mostly in the parietal lobes, not frontal. So this phenomenon was found only in the case of one of these brain lobes, but it seems that parietal lobe is not that important for response inhibition. I mean, the frontal lobe is much more important, and in the frontal lobe there was no correlation. I'm simplifying now, I realize, but to make this picture clear, I have to simplify a bit. So the behavioral self-control is exerted by those who can afford it. That would be the interpretation of these findings. Let me use the military metaphor. Imagine that we have a fortress to defend. This beautiful fortress in northern Poland is not defended now. Of course, we have to buy a ticket, entrance ticket, but it used to be defended, and it was defended. The question of the defense, the question of the decision how to defend this kind of fortress is a self-control task, of course. Imagine the commander-in-chief, which is responsible for the defense of this, not this, but another fortress. He deploys the troops. Before the siege, he deploys the troops at the minimal level, and he deploys the troops in some very specific places, very dangerous places. When the battle begins, the commander A is strengthening his troops. I mean, he must decide to strengthen the defense. This is a reasonable decision, but this is not the best one, I would say. Because imagine another commander-in-chief, which at the beginning behaves exactly the same. Both are professionals and both prepare for the siege in the same manner. However, when the siege begins, this second commander, Commander B, is strengthening his troops selectively, not everywhere, but only in these places which are very important. Because of this decision, he still has reserves, still have some troops to spare in case of danger. And this is exactly what we found in our brains. Well, not our brains, but in the brains of our participants. The point is that there is no commander-in-chief in the brain. We didn't see it. There is nobody who tells the brain regions to be more or less active. It's like self-regulation. The brain acts as a self-organizing system, and self-control is exerted by the self-regulatory manner, in the self-regulatory manner as well. So to conclude, we would say that humans must undertake conscious effort in order to learn rules and norms, but the individual capacity of following rules and obeying norms depends on the self-regulatory power of his or her brain. And this is our conclusion. Thank you for your attention.
We have exactly 10 minutes for questions and comments.
Okay, two short questions. First question is, self-control is necessary for characterizing normativity. It's not sufficient in the sense that you can have self-control, but you do it because of instrumental reasons. Unless you have a very broad sense of normativity, I could decide to do something, a sort of self-control, but because it's convenient for me, right? Not because I would like to comply with the norm, right? So this leads to the second question, which you already mentioned in your talk, the effect of norm activation. You said, norm activation is important. So my question is, do you have a way for checking norm activation? Because actually, you may, for example, have internalized the norm, but you don't consider the norm as a way for reasoning, For example, toothpaste example. I don't think that toothpaste choice is a moral choice, but I know that everybody here considers this choice as moral, and I know that. So in that case, I know that for you it's a moral choice, but it's not moral for me. So in that sense, I may have a norm internalized, but it's not active, right? So is it possible to handle this stuff in your thoughts?
Difficult questions. First, I agree that self-control is necessary for normative behavior, but it's not sufficient. That's obvious. I mean, being a psychologist, I'm concentrating on this kind of stuff which is accessible or possible to investigate with our tools. But I agree with you that the broader sense of normativity needs more complicated picture, of course. The question of activation, that's my point. I mean, of course, if we assume that usually people behave automatically, and the automaticity is the default mode of our behavior, having norms, even having pretty much developed system of norms is not enough. I mean, one has to be activated. I mean, a norm has to be activated. How? Thanks to which factors? That's another question. In psychological experiments, sometimes it's enough to prime people with something. Priming with a short stimulus showing that this is the moral choice or this is the moral dilemma. It's not automatic. I mean, be aware, be cautious. That's enough sometimes. But in the real life, it's a lot of other mechanisms to activate the norm. But I agree that without activation, normativity is not possible.
So maybe I'll just comment. So this was a very interesting talk, and this is a very popular topic, self-control, and there are all these conferences now everywhere in the world about self-control. And just like many others, you started with this Walter Mischel study, marshmallow study, and the statistics that is, you tell this story that Walter Mischel likes to tell about how how kids who waited longer for a marshmallow later became more successful and they got better jobs and better spouses and they had more children. But there's a little problem. There's a paper that just came out that finds out that kids who wait longer are the kids that come from more stable and wealthier homes. And the reason why this is relevant is because if you have a stable later home, your father, when he says, you know, you're going to get 2 candies later, will actually give you 2 candies later. Or, you know, if you do this, then you're going to go to play. So there are rules, and the kids develop expectations for later that waiting will give them better benefits. They become better temporal discounted, but not because they have more self-control. It's because they assume that the structure of the environment is different. And kids who have come from less stable homes basically grab whatever is there and just don't wait. So, you know, people have reanalyzed these data, and it turns out that, you know, there's very little in the success of later kids that is actually attributed to self-control. It's mostly the beliefs about different environments. So it's not really the mental ability to stop yourself. It's more really the assumptions that you make about whether, you know, waiting is good for you or not good for you. So, yeah, so it's mostly a comment, but I think it says something about whether, you know, these are norms in the sense of necessity to inhibit yourself, like having pre-programmed responses to results, or norms in the sense of, you know, general structural expectations.
Well, I wouldn't say, I mean, it's maybe I was not clear enough, but this is not my point that self-control needs just the cognitive ability or the brain mechanism. Of course, the situational factors and environment and parental influences and things like that may interact with these mental factors, producing the end product. And that's very probable. On one hand, you can look at children who are raised in the same family, and they have the same influences and the same environment in general. We realize that even the same family produces different environments for different children. But for simplicity, let's assume that this is the same environment. Still, you have huge differences between children in the one and the same family.
The questions to what extent are these differences? I'm sorry, I don't want to belabor this point. Because, you know, I mean, you know, just this is going to be like a crude, intuitive example, but there are lots of very, very small.
I'm sorry, but you know, there are other questions.
Okay, anyway, I'll talk later.
Thank you very much for your talk. My question is about your interesting finding about the negative correlation between the self-control questionnaire and the activation, the differential activation. Differential activation. Now, probably is not different from what you think. I think is a very plausible interpretation of the results. But it's possible that subjects that usually exert more self-control have developed more some automaticity of self-control. So if they are more efficient because they do usually exert self-control. So when they face your task, they don't need at that point to exert self-control, and only if the task gets more difficult, they eventually will. So your reserve means that just they have practiced a lot self-control, they realize they have self-control, and this is why you get that negative correlation.
Oh, that's pretty possible. The more so that we know this phenomenon from the studies on intelligence, for instance. In the studies on brain correlates of intelligence, the so-called efficiency hypothesis has been demonstrated and even proved to some extent, meaning that intelligent brains pay less for the same task. I mean, they are less activated if doing the IQ test, for instance. However, if we look at the tasks which are at the comparable level for the individual, it's the opposite. I mean, because if we compare two people who do the same task, for the one of them which is pretty intelligent, this task is quite easy. So the brain is less active, relatively less active, because the task is very easy. The same task may be difficult for another person. However, if you compare not the same task, but the tasks of the relative difficulty, I mean, for the person, I mean, 80% of probability of failure, for instance, for everybody, and we compare their brains, we have the opposite pattern. Intelligent brains are more active. And this is pretty possible that we have the same phenomenon here, but we are unable to do that at the moment.
One more question. Can I? I would like to refer to the former question a little bit, and the question will be very simple. If we know that there are so huge differences in our brain activity while we do the tasks like that, so the most obvious question is whether we can improve our ability to self-control, and whether you have any chances to test it, because it's much more, in my understanding, it would be much more harder to test this self-control on this example of the children who are trying to restrain themselves from eating the cake. But it would be much more easier, I think, to test it when we know the neural correlates. So we can draft some experiments and compare whether we have any chances in this brain activity. And the question is whether such experiments have already been done or drafted, at least.
I cannot tell you exactly, but that's a very important question. To which extent we can train this ability, we can develop it through the deliberately practices. Of course, the humanity practiced self-control training for ages, like prayers, meditations, things like that. But we don't have enough knowledge for now concerning the brain changes. What are the brain consequences of these kind of practices? That's a good question.
Okay, so let's finish.